In this video, we're going to talk about how to read philosophy. So this presentation comes from Reading Philosophy with Background Knowledge and Metacognition by David Concepción. There are a few adjustments that I've made to sort of suit my own style, but this mostly comes in the flagging section, and most of these words come directly from the article that is identified there. Professor Concepción is a professor of philosophy and religious studies at Ball State University in Indiana. And he writes extensively about teaching and learning in philosophy and leads faculty workshops about diversity and inclusive pedagogy across North America. I actually had the opportunity to meet him when he gave one of these workshops at the university where I was getting my PhD. And this is sort of the cutting edge information on this topic. So, if you don't know how to read philosophy in the way that philosophers expect you to, you might find the experience confusing and frustrating. Now, you may be surprised to learn that there's more than one way to read. And today, of course, we're going to be talking about how to read philosophy. So, what to expect while you're learning to read philosophy? Remember that reading philosophy is a skill, and it takes practice, like all skills. And along the way, you're going to make mistakes, and that's all right. You're also going to get frustrated and need to ask for help sometimes. There's also probably going to be other times where the things that you read make you really angry because they might go against what you were brought up to believe or what you believe otherwise, and sometimes the arguments are so good that it's hard to see a way through it. This is all part of the experience. In philosophy class, you're going to find unfamiliar vocabulary, abstract ideas, complexly organized writings, and sometimes, as I mentioned, unsettling views. And it's normal to have certain reactions to this kind of thing, such as confusion, outrage, and even frustration. But don't worry. Don't confuse these reactions with failure. Many people who've come before you have had the same initial reactions, and they've succeeded. I myself included. In fact, basically anytime I start a new project and I start going through the literature for that project, I always get really overwhelmed and I'm convinced that I can't do it. It's just sort of part of the process. The ultimate goal in this class is to develop or to become more confident in your personal belief system by building on what you already know about yourself and the world. By evaluating arguments regarding controversial issues, you should learn to take a well-justified stand that you're able to defend. Now, lots of people have stands that they're willing to defend, but here what we're looking for is a well-justified stand that you're able to defend. So, when you read philosophy, you should look for arguments, reasons, and conclusions, rather than facts, plot, or character development, to help you reach your goal of evaluating the plausibility of various positions a person might take on some issue that we're considering. And, as normal, there's various things that you can do that are considered good reading behaviors. First of all, take care of yourself. So take breaks, sit where you won't be distracted, and give yourself enough time to read well. It's also important to interact with the material, so talk to your friends and your classmates about what you've read. Use a dictionary or a philosophical encyclopedia while reading if there's things that you need to look up or you're wondering what they mean. And remember that you're reading one person's contribution to an ongoing debate, and it's okay to disagree with the author. In fact, it's encouraged. Keep reasonable expectations as well. You may not understand everything without some effort, and you may need to ask for help or for clarification. This is okay. And our goal is to be able to state the author's conclusion and the gist of the argument for that conclusion by the time you're finished with each module. It says before you come to class there. Obviously, that only applies in the in-person classes. And online, the idea is to be able to state the author's conclusion and the gist of the argument by the end of the module. It's similarly the case with evaluating the author's arguments. And as we'll see, we're going to talk for a while about the importance of flagging and taking notes. Now, there are a couple different ways that we can read, as I mentioned. One way is reading for information, and the other is reading for enlightenment. Reading for information involves passing your eyes over words until some information about the world sticks in your head. I would imagine that we all have plenty of experience doing this kind of thing. However, there's also reading for enlightenment. Now, when you read for enlightenment, you'd use a text as an opportunity to reflect on yourself and on your beliefs. Part of the reason why reading for enlightenment is not easy is because self-evaluation often results in personal growth, and sometimes when we grow, we experience growing pains, which is to say that sometimes it can be uncomfortable to experience this growth. Now, I'm sure that you're all familiar with the distinction between primary and secondary sources, and in philosophy, we use this in a slightly different way. So, in this course, we're going to consider both primary and secondary sources, and a primary source is a text where a person actually argues that a certain position is correct. Well, a secondary source is a text that describes what other people have argued. And interestingly, often in philosophy, one can sort of bleed into the other because you will often describe what other people have argued right before you make your own argument. Okay, so let's move on to facet 1 of the reading process. This is stage setting, or the pre-read. So when you first pick up a piece of philosophy, for a very short time, what you should do is examine the general features of the article. Okay, so the reading that goes along with this assignment is just a short paragraph that has a heading and a subheading and a couple other details on the page. So just sort of examine what is going on. Look at the title, any section headings, footnotes, bibliography, reading questions, the biography of the author, anything that's included in the reading, just to kind of see what's there. The goal of the pre-read is to get a basic idea of what the article is about. If you know what an article is about, it's easier to make sense of the individual sentences in it. Also, while you're doing the pre-read, skim the first and last paragraph to see if you can easily identify a focal or thesis statement. Philosophers often include these at either the beginning or restated at the end of a reading. A focal statement describes the topic of a text. So focal statements often begin with phrases such as, I will discuss X, Y, and Z. A thesis statement, on the other hand, is a more specific description of the author's goals. Thesis statements often begin with phrases such as, I will show X is true and Y and Z are false. So, while you're doing this, you can ask yourself the following questions to figure out how you're doing. Is this a primary or secondary text? Should I expect an argument or a description of an argument? Am I reading for information or for enlightenment? What's the focal statement of this article? Is there a thesis statement? If so, what is it? What should I expect to find in the text in light of the title? Are there section headings? If there are, what can I learn about the article from these? Is there a bibliography? If so, what can I learn about the article from it? Are there footnotes? Are they essential to the document, or are they just telling me where the information came from? Are there reading questions attached? And if there are, in light of these questions, what can I expect to find in the text? After completing part 1 of facet 1, we can move on to part 2, which is the fast read. Here, you want to read the entire article fairly quickly. The goal of the fast read is to develop a basic understanding of the text. When doing the fast read, remember to do the following. Identify the thesis statement. Look up definitions of words you don't know and write them in the margins. And flag the structure of the article in as much detail as possible without getting bogged down. I'll talk about what flagging means shortly. All right. Well, identifying the thesis statement, you want to be aware that you may not be able to do this until you've reached the end of the article. Mark anything that seems like it might be a thesis statement or conclusion when you first notice it, then pick the one that seems most central when you're done. In some cases, the author may not even actually write a thesis statement down, so you may need to write one for the author. While you're looking up definitions of words you don't know and writing them in the margins, be careful not to get bogged down while doing this. Remember, we're doing the fast read. If it's too difficult to figure out the meaning of a term, just sort of note that that term is difficult and move on. Dictionary apps on your phone or your computer can be very useful here. I have the dictionary app ready on my computer so that when I'm sitting down, I often look up words. I also have a couple of different dictionary apps on my phone depending on what I'm up to. All right. Now, as far as flagging the structure of the article, flagging the structure of the article in as much detail as possible without getting bogged down is the goal here. When you flag a text, you put marks in it that'll allow you to reconstruct the meaning of the text without having to reread the entire text again. And I'm going to give specific suggestions on how to flag an article a little bit later. All right, so we can look forward to that. Now, remember, when you're doing the fast read, don't let anything stop your progress. This is the fast read. You may skim long examples while you're doing this. While you're going through the fast read to see how you're doing, you can ask yourself the following questions. Have I identified the thesis statement and written it down? Do I know what the conclusion of the author's argument is? And have I marked places in the text where important steps towards that conclusion occur? All right. After we've completed Facet 1, we move on to Facet 2. Facet 2 is the understanding facet. This will allow you to develop a sophisticated understanding of the text. You should be able to explain to a friend how the author defends his or her conclusion. Once you're able to coherently explain the article in your own words, you've truly internalized it. This is pretty cool. When reading for understanding, remember to do the following things. Reread the entire article very carefully. Correct and add to your previous flagging, and take lots of notes. In these notes, rephrase what the author says in your own words. While you're doing this, it's important to practice the principle of charity. Describe the author's views in the most favorable way possible. This is important, and we're going to run into this a lot. There's going to be times when what the author is arguing for is going to seem so strange that you can't imagine anyone actually arguing for this. Usually what's going on when you feel that way is that you don't understand the complexity of the argument. The principle of charity helps us avoid this. If you have trouble taking notes, you can even stop at the end of every section or paragraph or sometimes every sentence and mentally rephrase the meaning of the text into your own words to try to make sense of it. When reading for understanding, remember to do the following. You can draw diagrams or flowcharts, the major moves in the article, if this helps you. You can bring together all your work so far into a summary that's detailed enough that you don't have to reread the article again to remind yourself of the author's arguments. While you're in this phase, you can ask yourself, how am I doing, by answering the following questions. Do I know exactly what the author's saying? Have I reread the passage that were confusing at first? Can I connect the dots and understand what's going on? Can I explain in my own words why the author concludes what he or she concludes? In the fast read, you find the conclusion and do your best to figure out the steps to it. In the read for understanding, you come to fully understand each step in detail. This leads us to Facet 3, evaluating. Now that you've made yourself a concise and easy to articulate summary of the author's argument, it's time to evaluate it. When evaluating, your main tool is the summary you made, but you'll need to reread certain passages, depending on their complexity and how well you understand them. At this stage, you're entering the debate rather than simply learning about it. When evaluating a text, remember to do the following. Fix any mistaken flags as you reread important passages, and write down anything new that you discover as you're going through the text again. To determine how well you're doing, you can answer the following questions. Have I looked to see if every conclusion in the text is well defended? Have I thought about how an undefended conclusion could be defended? Have I been charitable? Do I think the argument for the conclusions are persuasive? Why or why not? Can I think of any counterexamples to any assertions made by the author? Can I put my finger on exactly what bothers me about what the author is saying? Can I explain where and why I think the author made a mistake? Have I thought about how the author might respond to my criticism? Have I identified some of my own beliefs that can't be true if the author is right? Is there a conflict between what I believe and what the author says? If so, to avoid being a hypocrite, I must ultimately change my mind or show that the author's reasoning fails in some way. Simply identifying a disagreement doesn't constitute an evaluation. Have I figured out exactly what the author got wrong so that I may continue to believe as I always have with confidence? Have I figured out exactly which of my beliefs I must change in light of what I've learned from the author? Have I looked for some point that the author did not consider that might influence what I think is true? All right, now we're going to move on to an explanation of flagging. When you flag a text, you put short notes, preferably in pencil, in the margins of the text that'll remind you of many details in the text so that you don't have to reread the entire text to reconstruct the meaning when you go back to it. Flagging marks allow you to pick out various important features of the text for further study. Now notice that flagging is better than highlighting. And this is because flagging is more detailed than highlighting. If all you're interested in is distinguishing something that seems important from other stuff that doesn't seem important, then highlighting's fine. But you want to do more than this. You want to distinguish more than just what's important from what's not important. There's more than one kind of important thing in a philosophy text, and you want to mark your text in such a way that you can tell the difference between the important things. Another good thing about flagging is that you can unflag, and you can't really unhighlight. The flexibility to change your notes is important because sometimes as you read further into a text or reread it a second time, you realize that something seemed important that really isn't that important. All right, so there are many different ways to flag a text, and you should develop your own method and notations. You should use whatever marks are helpful to you to attain the goal of noting the different types of important parts of a text. A part of a text is important when it must be present for the author's conclusion to make sense. And I'll note here that these skills will be applicable in all of your other classes. Absolutely. This will be very helpful, not just in philosophy class. Now I'm going to give you a few examples of flagging from some of my readings. So here, that ended up a little more blurry than I had intended, but we see a couple of notes that I've put in the margins. We can't see exactly what they say, unfortunately, but they're very precise notes about what's going on in those passages. And then there underneath, I am reconstructing arguments from those passages so that I have them when I return. Here is another example that's a little bit more clear. So again, we see clearly explaining what's going on. Here, I identify chunks that make up arguments, and then I identify what the argument is for. And here, we see a previous flag that I'd crossed out. Now, I could have erased it, but I didn't want to do that because I wanted to be reminded of the mistake that I'd made earlier so that I didn't make the same mistake. Here's another example of a flagging. This is where an author is identifying a bunch of different concepts that he's going to use throughout. And what I like to do in these situations is write what each of the things are that are being defined. This way, when I need to go back and see where they are, I can just quickly go through my flags until I find the one that I need. Now, as I said, it's important for you to come up with your own set of flagging marks, but some other possible ones you might use that I've used from time to time. Use an exclamation point if something is surprising to me. A question mark if I don't really understand what's going on. This one's pretty important. Why if I don't understand why something would be true. Maybe what if I don't understand what the author is saying. Or really, if I think that the claim is kind of obnoxious. Another thing I like to do is to number the premises of an argument as it moves through the passage, and I do this by putting 1s and 2s and 3s. It can also be important to identify the conclusions of arguments or objections by writing conclusion or objection in the margin. Now, you're probably most used to linear writing. However, most philosophy is written dialogically. Linear writing moves in a straightforward way from one idea to the next without examining many or any supporting or contrary ideas. However, dialogical writing explicitly acknowledges and responds to criticism. It may be helpful to think of philosophical writing as a monologue that contains a dialogue. And we're definitely going to see a lot of this in our class as philosophers consider, as they're going, objections to their own view. Often in a philosophy paper, the author's speaking directly to you, delivering a monologue for your consideration. We'll discover that often philosophy is written in the first person. But in the monologue, the author's telling you about a dialogue or debate that she or he knows about, while giving you reasons for thinking that her or his understanding of that debate is right. As you know, in some debates there are more than two sides, and sometimes people on the same side have different reasons for believing what they believe. Authors will take time to tell you about as many sides or different camps within one side as they think you need to know about to understand and be persuaded by their view. This confuses people sometimes because it's hard to keep track of whether the author is arguing for their side or talking from another point of view or camp within the same side or for the sake of argument. So a few points to remember about dialogical philosophical texts. Authors sometimes support their views with thought experiments. A thought experiment is an example that asks you to imagine how things would be if something that is not true were true. Authors sometimes argue that other thinkers haven't noticed an important difference between two things. Authors also often draw a lot of distinctions. A few points to remember about dialogical philosophical texts. Authors sometimes argue that another philosopher's views or arguments ought to be rejected. There's something really tricky going on here. Fair-minded writers will practice the principle of charity, but according to the principle of charity, one should give one's opponent the benefit of the doubt. One should respond to the best thing that someone who disagrees with you could say, even if they didn't notice it. Sometimes attempts to abide by the principle of charity can result in authors presenting arguments for the correctness of views that they're ultimately going to reject. This is, for the sake of good argument, some authors will present reasons for thinking that their critics are right. Try to avoid mistaking charitable clarification for the author's main argument. Now, successful philosophy readers abide by the basic good reading behaviors, Before class or by the end of the module, they've completed all 3 facets of reading well, and they flag and take notes to keep track of where they are in the dialogue.